One of the things us Bitcoiners hear a lot is, but Bitcoin wastes and uses too much energy.
I think we have all heard Bitcoin uses too much energy. We've heard this trope more times than we can possibly count. And it's shocking because despite the mountain of data, all of the evidence out there showing the benefits of Bitcoin mining around the world, some people still seem to be laboring under the delusion that Bitcoin is a waste of energy.
But as Alex Gladstein says, not mining Bitcoin is actually wasting energy.
Hopefully this next presentation will clear up any lingering confusion that's out there. We have the State of Digital Mining from the Cambridge Digital Mining Industry Report in 2025, presented by Alexander Neumuller. Please give him a warm welcome to the stage.
Thanks. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Alexander Neumuller and I was already kindly introduced. I'm a researcher at the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, where my work is predominantly focused on the essentially energy and environmental footprint of digital assets. And yeah, today it's really a great pleasure to present you our latest findings of our mining report. And also, if there's still some time left, I want to talk a bit about kind of the intersection of mining and AI, which I think is becoming an ever more prominent topic. But let's start a bit who we are actually. So the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, our work is primarily related to essentially empirical research and also knowledge transfer to regulators and supervisors globally. We have, over the last about a decade, we have published more than now 60 thematic reports, have educated over 3,500 regulators and supervisors. And for these stakeholders, we also created what we call the Regulatory Knowledge Exchange, which is essentially kind of a community-driven platform where those stakeholders can interact with each other. And we have now, I think, more than 2,500 members there from over 200 jurisdictions. Interestingly, my work is not so much related to the core focus of our center. So my work is really kind of focused more on the finding, most likely we are possibly some of you know us from our work on Bitcoin's energy, or specifically electricity consumption. But we are also looking into kind of general key environmental metrics, right, from energy consumption to emissions and those sort of aspects. And I think we already are, to some extent, quite prominent in that regard. But as in the past, essentially before this publication, we were predominantly reliant on theoretical modeling, right? And not so much real-world data. And I think this is really what has changed with this publication, and yeah, also why I'm here today. We published the report in, I think, end of April this year, and it really, I think, is a culmination of a lot of work where I want to give a big shout out to the Bitcoin Mining Council team, actually, who were instrumental in helping us, connecting us with key industry stakeholders, ultimately, which was really, really helpful to get these connections. And one of the reasons why I joined the research center actually was I was trying to, I think many of you are still familiar with specifically 2020, 2021, when there was the discussion about Bitcoin and energy really flaring up. This was kind of the key point in time where we had stories about boiling the oceans and then consuming all the electricity in the world and all these kind of things. So at that point, I was actually studying at Cambridge, and the research center was just across the street. So I thought, okay, I really think is a point where I can make an impact. First of all, look into the theoretical modeling and try to, given I had a mining background myself, help in the theoretical modeling, but then also trying to gradually bridge the gap between theory and practice, which ultimately culminated in this kind of report where we were actively engaging kind of industry stakeholders and collecting the data from there. So I think this was really kind of a leap forward to achieving this goal. Before delving into the survey, a bit about the respondent base. So actually we were quite overwhelmed by the support and engagement we saw from the mining community, which ultimately yielded in us having a sample that represented nearly half of the entire global mining activity. And you can see some of our participants there, and we're really grateful for them, but there were also those who decided to remain anonymous. And again, like really grateful for them to spend the time to take part in our study, because ultimately without their engagement, none of this would have happened, honestly. If we look into kind of the distribution of our respondent base, so we saw a bit more than half of our respondents being non-US domiciled and about close to half US domiciled. So naturally, when we looked into kind of the specific country mining activity, that carried a bit over, but I think overall we managed to find some very directionally relevant trends, kind of compared to our latest data point that was from early 2022. At that point, where we saw the US really cementing its kind of really key position as a global mining hub, but also we saw a notable activity in South America and the Middle East. We saw continued activity in Northern Europe, and also emerging activity in Africa. And then yet our countries that we know were kind of underrepresented, most notably Russia, where we actually expect that there is not really kind of significant mining activity in the range of about 10-15%. And then there is China, which is generally a black box, right? Our internal estimates put it at about like upper single-digit percentage. Yeah, there are other estimates out there that says it's higher, but ultimately I have not seen any really concrete data that could help in that regard. If we now start with really kind of the key insights in the report with hardware and firmware. So first of all, I want to take kind of a moment to appreciate the technological progress we have seen over the last years, where we really saw kind of from the first generation of ASICs, huge increases in efficiency, 166 times to be specific, or even more so because the latest generations are not included here. But also kind of huge increases in computational density, where in the past, essentially, a unit had well below 1 terahash, and now we see units with like hundreds of terahash and close to petahash in some cases. If we now go to our survey, we look at the hardware market, then it shows a very, I think, concentrated picture. We see 3 manufacturers essentially dominating the entire market, which is Bitmain, MicroBT, and Canaan. However, what I need to say here, that this data is from last year in the summer. I think much has changed, and we saw a lot of new entrants coming to the market. For instance, Bitdeer with their Seedle miner, we see Auradine, Proto, etc. So if I think we would do the survey now, we would see possibly a slightly different picture, and I would actually be very keen to see myself how the market has evolved since then. When we look at firmware, we also see that stock firmware essentially is the default, but also notable uptake when it comes to third-party firmware solutions or proprietary solutions. When we look now into kind of the energy side, kind of the electricity consumption, one of the more heavily debated subject areas, if we look at network-wide hardware efficiency, that's very important for that. We see that from essentially June 2022 to June 2024, we estimate that based on kind of survey data from our survey, but previously from the Bitcoin Mining Council, that we saw about efficiency increases of 30%, which means essentially that 30% of less energy is required per unit of computing power. And I think this is quite a notable change, but again here, if we would do the survey today, we would most likely see another like significant increase in efficiency. So our theoretical estimates suggest currently around 21 joules per terahash. What we also did was then we tried to benchmark our electricity consumption estimates with estimates that can be derived from survey data. And this was, I think, a very positive surprise for us because so the survey-based estimates are the dots you can see here previously from the Bitcoin Mining Council and the latest on our latest survey. And this orange line is our theoretical estimates, and you can see this really are very closely aligned. And if we think about it, we have 2 estimates that are based on really entirely different methodologies, but pretty much so the same result. I think this really gives or supports kind of the validity of both estimates. Very briefly here I just want to kind of show the difference between how hash rate has developed over a couple of years and how electricity consumption has developed since essentially early 2021 to end of December 2024. And we can see kind of that electricity has increased by about 111%, whereas hash rate has increased by over 450%. And I think this is again a testament for the increases in efficiency we have seen in mining hardware. Moving now on to, I think, the topic that at least I saw received the most traction in the past, but also now, when it comes to media attention, but also in public spaces like X, etc. is the electricity mix of Bitcoin, right? I think this is a huge topic and every one of you have most likely heard about it. And here we were really able to get some new data that I think was extremely helpful because we saw kind of a huge shift towards sustainable energy sources, which we define essentially as renewables plus nuclear. We now estimate about 52.4% as compared to in the past 37.6%. But what is actually equally important is also a change in the composition of the fossil fuel mix, because what we saw was coal largely being replaced by natural gas. And that is really important when we look into, here we go. Now we have it. When we talk about emissions, right? Because the emission intensity of coal is a lot higher than that of natural gas. And when we use this kind of new electricity mix in our modeling, we found that we see actually a drop in emissions by 43%. So that was really kind of a significant finding and underscores the importance of always having very contemporary data when it comes to the electricity mix. Another big topic that I think, or most of you have heard of, is kind of the positive externalities, right? We always talk about negatives, like electricity consumption, all these kind of things. But ultimately, I think some see Bitcoin, for instance, as a technology that might have a potential positive impact on the environment, most prominently when it comes to, for instance, utilizing otherwise flared or vented natural or biogas. We have heard, I think, many kind of reports, etc., talking about this topic, and that it is kind of a potential benefit. But then what we wanted to do with our survey, we actually wanted to put a name to the face, right? Okay, what figures are we even talking about? Because that is very important when you speak to certain kind of stakeholders to actually have some idea about the numbers. And here we estimate about 0.3 to 4.7 million metric tons CO2 equivalents. You can imagine this is about a bit less than 1% or to a bit more than 10% of Bitcoin's total emissions. So in any case, it's quite significant. But it also demonstrates that this kind of modeling is still very much reliant on assumptions, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done in that regard. But this is a topic that I'm personally very passionate about, because gas flaring, specifically on oil and gas fields, is a huge issue globally, right? There's the World Bank has the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative. And this, for me personally, is just a very interesting topic because it very, very much resembles this kind of Adam Smith's invisible hand at work somehow, where you do good essentially, not really out of pure virtue, but actually just out of economic self-interest. In that case, it's miners just trying to get cheap energy, right? But in doing so, they actually do something good for the environment. Very briefly about mining economics, I think many of you are very familiar with the topic, but I still wanted to show some charts here. So essentially, you see this purple line that shows the total block rewards in Bitcoin. And we see this declining, right? We have every 210,000 blocks, the halvings. We started in 2011. There were still like total block rewards in Bitcoin were about 3 million, and that dropped down to in 2024 to below 250,000. But when we look in US dollar terms, and that are the bars essentially, you can clearly see an entirely different trend, right? Where in dollar terms, the total block rewards really increased, and we see in 2024 about $15 billion. For miners, that's unfortunately not the end of the story. For miners, things are a bit more complicated because something called hash rate is coming into force as well, which also affects their profitability. And for that purpose, the industry has a specific metric, which they call hash price, which essentially captures a lot of different factors. And there we see basically from early 2020 to end of 2024, hash price dropping by about 60%, driven by difficulty increases, driven by essentially the halvings, despite Bitcoin price rising by more than 1,200%. And I think this also kind of shows that this is quite a competitive industry. Lastly, for the mining report, a bit of the sentiment. So it was also important for us to gauge a bit the sentiment of miners when it comes to what are their key concerns, how do they manage the risk, and what are kind of really growth constraining factors. When we first start with what keeps miners awake at night, and we look at their kind of upper side here, we can see, most likely not surprisingly, the kind of long-term electricity price increases. We see unfavorable governmental action and also adverse development in the Bitcoin price. Less kind of risky might seem the kind of counterparty risk or local resident complaints. Counterparty risk is an interesting one. This was more actually specifically asked for hosting services. Some miners just don't use these services, right? They operate their own kind of infrastructure. But for those, for instance, that use those third-party hosting services, that is actually sometimes a serious concern. If we look at kind of how miners manage their risk, we can see essentially, most likely not surprisingly, power hedging is one of the key kind of risk mitigation measures, but also diversification of business model, namely to AI, for instance, or like geographical diversification as well. And lastly, when we look into kind of growth constraints, we can see there's this lack of deployment opportunities, procurement and logistical challenges. Most likely, if we will ask this question this year, the procurement and logistical challenges would be on top. But yeah, also financing, right? Debt, whether that's debt or equity. And yes, I still have a bit of time left. So another topic that I'm personally very keen on is kind of the intersection of digital mining and AI. And for that, I have a chart here that kind of shows you the vast increase kind of in computational needs of AI. And since 2010, kind of leading edge AI models have, the computational intensity has increased by about 6 to 7 times per year. And it really shows kind of this exponential growth of computational requirements. To give you an idea of how data center clusters are distributed around the world, I think is also quite interesting. And we see clusters very heavily concentrated in certain regions of the world, which is, I think, not too surprising. But yes, the US definitely being really a hotspot when it comes to data center activity. And when we even zoom further in and actually look into the pipeline of announced projects, we can clearly see that this build out of data center infrastructure is not going to slow down. And we are definitely going to see a lot of new development here, and this raises some critical questions, right? So for particularly how to integrate all these new load into the existing electric power system. Particularly since many data centers exhibit kind of a high variability of load, right? So specifically when we think about AI inferencing, there's just a very high variability. And secondly, scale. So there's a study from McKinsey. They estimate actually that by 2030, just the power demand of AI workloads will be about 3.5 times of today's levels. And now if we have essentially this kind of high variability of the kind of data center load and then the scale, I think conversations, particularly with utility operators, will be challenging because you need to find one who actually will be willing to serve kind of this large variable load without any sort of conditions, or at the very least, most likely it will affect your contractual terms. And kind of now a bit to the point of why I'm speaking about this, kind of how mining can fit in there. So basically, as I think many of you are aware, Bitcoin mining is very flexible, and it can be used in these kind of instances to fill those valleys you see there, right? So for instance, if there is a decrease in demand for AI inferencing, you basically ramp up your mining activity. And if as demand for instance, AI inferencing is increasing, you ramp down. So you kind of fill those valleys, and the mining is essentially a tool here, a balancing tool that really can help you to, in some cases, first of all, create some economic value as a data center operator, but also demonstrate, for instance, to utility a bit of a more relatively constant power draw. That, and that is really important, is flexible when it needs to be flexible. Which, yeah, brings me to my next topic, like the importance of flexibility. So I believe that in the future, it will be at least as important to, when electricity is being consumed, that how much electricity is being consumed. And to kind of drive the point home a bit, I used here a study from the International Energy Agency. So if you just introduce about the 1% flexibility, there would already the potential to unlock currently about 70 gigawatts in the United States alone. And that would be sufficient to satisfy the kind of entire expected demand of additional data centers in the US until 2035. And why is this the case? So grid operators need to plan for peak demand, which is essentially, imagine everyone switches on everything at the same time, and they need to plan for that sort of scenario. But in reality, actually, this is not the case, because those kind of hours where really this situation happens are very few. And I put here an example of a load duration curves essentially that show kind of in how many hours, what level of system demand there is. And what you can really see here is that only in a very tiny fraction of hours per year, like let's say 1%, that's about 86 hours per year, the grid is really under stress, right? But during the rest of the time, there is really an opportunity to unlock potential, right? And this is kind of where the previously mentioned 70 gigawatts essentially come from, where essentially what you do is you just use what's there more effectively. So you keep this kind of hours during the stress happens, you keep those constant, right? But you essentially integrate the load during the remaining 99%. But for that, you need also a customer who is willing to service, or who is actually willing to adjust or curtail their load during those critical hours, right? And this is not everyone. For instance, if you're a steel plant, that is going to be a bit tricky, right? To shut down everything for like 2 hours. And that's one of the examples where, for instance, Bitcoin mining, I think, is very well suited to kind of operate in this very flexible environment. And yes, that brings me actually to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope it was informative. I'm still sticking around here today and tomorrow, so if you have any questions or want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out, and have a great remaining day in Lugano.